The Balfour Declaration of 1917 is one of the most controversial and politically charged documents in modern history, and its legacy continues to be the source of intense debate and conflict, particularly surrounding the creation of the State of Israel and the ongoing Palestinian-Israeli conflict. From an anti-British perspective, the Balfour Declaration can be viewed as a criminal act of imperialism, manipulation, and betrayal, driven by British colonial interests rather than any genuine concern for the welfare of the Jewish or Arab populations of the region. This essay will explore why the Balfour Declaration should be regarded as a British crime, dissecting it from various angles, historical, political, and ethical, while condemning the British government's role in shaping the current Middle Eastern crisis. The context: British colonialism and the scramble for the Middle East. To fully grasp the criminal nature of the Balfour Declaration, it is essential to first understand the geopolitical context in which it was issued. At the time, the British Empire was at its zenith, controlling vast territories around the globe through its colonial apparatus. By the early 20th century, the Middle East had become a region of immense strategic importance due to its proximity to India, the crown jewel of the British Empire, and its burgeoning oil reserves, which were beginning to reshape global industrial powers. The British were embroiled in World War I and had a vested interest in securing the post-war order in a way that would maintain their dominance in this critical region. The Ottoman Empire, which had ruled over Palestine for centuries, was on the verge of collapse, and the British saw an opportunity to carve up the Middle East for their own benefit. The Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 between Britain and France had already divided much of the Arab lands into zones of influence, with little regard for the aspirations of the local populations. In this context, the Balfour Declaration was nothing more than another imperialistic ploy designed to secure British interests in the Middle East, using Zionism as a convenient vehicle for their geopolitical aims. The Balfour Declaration: a flagrant violation of promises and ethics. Issued on November 2, 1917, the Balfour Declaration was a letter from British Foreign Secretary Arthur James Balfour to Lord Rothschild, a prominent leader of the British Jewish community. In this letter, Balfour expressed the British government's support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, a land that was predominantly inhabited by Arabs at the time. The key sentence of the declaration reads, "His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine." At first glance, this might seem like a diplomatic and balanced statement, but upon closer examination, it becomes clear that the Balfour Declaration was deeply flawed and inherently unethical. The British had no moral or legal right to promise Palestine to the Jewish people because it was not theirs to give. The land was home to a predominantly Arab population, with Muslims, Christians, and Jews living side by side for centuries. By issuing the declaration, Britain disregarded the rights of the indigenous Arab population, sowing the seeds of future conflict. Betrayal of Arab allies. The Balfour Declaration also constituted a blatant betrayal of Britain's Arab allies. During World War I, the British had courted Arab support in their fight against the Ottoman Empire by promising Arab independence in exchange for assistance in defeating the Ottomans. The McMahon-Hussein correspondence, 1915 to 1916, between Sir Henry McMahon, the British High Commissioner in Egypt, and Sharif Hussein of Mecca, the leader of the Arab revolt, outlined British promises to support the creation of an independent Arab state in the post-war period. However, the Balfour Declaration completely ignored these commitments, as Palestine was included in the area promised to the Arabs. This duplicity exemplifies the cynical and manipulative nature of British diplomacy during this period. The British were willing to promise the same territory to different groups, Zionists and Arabs, without any intention of honoring their word to the Arabs. This two-faced approach highlights the extent to which Britain prioritized its imperial interests over any concern for justice, fairness, or the legitimate aspirations of the local population. Such actions were not only morally indefensible, but also laid the groundwork for decades of conflict and suffering in the region. A colonial project disguised as humanitarianism. One of the most insidious aspects of the Balfour Declaration was its use of humanitarian language to justify what was essentially a colonial project. The British framed their support for the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine as an act of benevolence towards the Jewish people, who had faced centuries of persecution in Europe. However, this narrative conveniently ignores the fact that Britain had little interest in the welfare of European Jews and was primarily concerned with securing its own geopolitical interests. British self-interest and Zionism. It is important to note that the British government's support for Zionism was not driven by any genuine sympathy for Jewish suffering. Instead, it was motivated by a range of pragmatic considerations. First, the British believed that aligning themselves with the Zionist movement would help them gain influence over Jewish populations in Russia and the United States, both of which were seen as crucial to the war effort. By issuing the Balfour Declaration, Britain hoped to win the support of influential Jewish figures in these countries and, by extension, strengthen their position in the war. Second, the British saw the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine as a means of securing a strategic foothold in the region. By fostering a pro-British Zionist state in the heart of the Middle East, Britain could protect its interests in the Suez Canal, which was vital to maintaining control over its empire in India and the Far East. The creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, therefore, was not an act of altruism, but rather a calculated move to enhance British imperial power. The aftermath, chaos, conflict, and colonial control. The Balfour Declaration set in motion a series of events that would have disastrous consequences for the people of Palestine and the broader Middle East. In the decades following the declaration, tensions between Jews and Arabs in Palestine escalated as Jewish immigration increased, leading to violent clashes and the eventual displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. The declaration's vague language and the British government's contradictory promises to both Jews and Arabs created a situation that was ripe for conflict, and the British did little to prevent the violence that followed. The British mandate colonialism in action. Following the end of World War I, the League of Nations granted Britain a mandate to govern Palestine, effectively making the region a British colony. The British mandate for Palestine from 1920 to 1948 was characterized by a policy of divide and rule, as the British sought to maintain control by playing Jews and Arabs against each other. During this period, the British government facilitated Jewish immigration and land acquisition in Palestine, further exacerbating tensions between the two communities. The British mandate was marked by a series of uprisings and revolts by the Arab population, who resented both the British presence and the increasing Jewish immigration. The Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939 was a particularly violent and bloody episode, during which the British authorities brutally suppressed Arab resistance, using tactics such as mass arrests, executions, and the destruction of homes and villages. Far from promoting peace or stability, the British presence in Palestine only deepened the divisions between Jews and Arabs and perpetuated a cycle of violence that continues to this day. The Nakba. Britain's role in the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. One of the most tragic and enduring consequences of the Balfour Declaration and British policy in Palestine was the Nakba, or catastrophe, of 1948. Following the United Nations partition plan, which proposed the creation of separate Jewish and Arab states, violence erupted across Palestine. In the ensuing war, Jewish forces, with the support of the British and other Western powers, forcibly expelled over 700,000 Palestinians from their homes, creating a massive refugee crisis that persists to this day. Britain's role in the Nakba cannot be overstated. By supporting the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine without regard for the rights of the indigenous Arab population, the British government bears significant responsibility for the displacement and suffering of the Palestinian people. The ethnic cleansing of Palestine was the direct result of the policies set in motion by the Balfour Declaration, and Britain must be held accountable for the crimes committed during this period. The legacy of British imperialism in the Middle East. The Balfour Declaration and the subsequent creation of the State of Israel are just one example of the destructive legacy of British imperialism in the Middle East. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, Britain sought to control the region through a combination of military force, political manipulation, and the imposition of artificial borders that ignored the ethnic, religious, and cultural realities on the ground. The arbitrary borders drawn by British and French colonialists in the aftermath of World War I, including those that created the modern states of Iraq, Syria, and Jordan, have led to decades of conflict, instability, and bloodshed. The Balfour Declaration is emblematic of the broader pattern of British imperialism, which was characterized by a complete disregard for the rights and aspirations of the people who lived in the territories that Britain sought to control. Rather than promoting self-determination or democracy, British policies in the Middle East were driven by the desire to maintain power and access to resources, regardless of the human cost. The suffering of the Palestinian people, the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and the broader instability in the region can all be traced back to the decisions made by the British government during and after World War I, particularly the Balfour Declaration. This document, while seemingly benign in its phrasing, ignited a chain reaction that led to colonial subjugation, ethnic displacement, and perpetual conflict in the Middle East. From a critical perspective, the Balfour Declaration and the subsequent actions of the British in Palestine are nothing short of a crime against the people of the region, with far-reaching consequences that still resonate today. The hypocrisy of British humanitarian rhetoric. The Balfour Declaration was presented as a humanitarian gesture toward the Jewish people, a population that had endured centuries of anti-Semitism and persecution in Europe. However, the motivations behind the declaration were far from humanitarian, and Britain's historical record demonstrates a clear pattern of self-interest. Throughout the colonial period, Britain used the rhetoric of civilizing missions and benevolence to justify its exploitation of colonized peoples. The supposed support for Jewish aspirations was no different. The fact that the Balfour Declaration was made without consulting the indigenous population of Palestine reveals the inherent hypocrisy of British policy. While British officials spoke of justice and the protection of minority rights, they consistently acted in ways that served their own imperial objectives. The Jewish people were merely a tool in this geopolitical game, and the Palestinian Arabs were collateral damage. The British government's disregard for the Palestinian population was not an oversight, but a deliberate strategy rooted in the colonial mentality that viewed non-European peoples as inferior and expendable. The myth of a national home and the reality of colonialism. The phrase national home for the Jewish people was deliberately vague, allowing the British to placate both Zionist aspirations and their own imperial objectives. However, this ambiguity only served to mask the reality that the establishment of a Jewish state would inevitably lead to the displacement and disenfranchisement of the Arab population. Palestine was not an empty land, and the idea of creating a Jewish homeland in a region with a predominantly Arab population was a recipe for disaster. The British government knew that its policy would provoke conflict, yet it proceeded regardless, demonstrating a complete lack of concern for the consequences of its actions. By promising a national home to the Jewish people in Palestine, Britain effectively set the stage for the systematic dispossession of the Palestinian Arabs, who would soon find themselves marginalized and powerless in their own homeland. This was not a benign or neutral act. It was the beginning of a process of colonial domination that would lead to decades of violence, oppression, and resistance. Divide and rule, the British strategy in Palestine. The British policy of divide and rule, which had been employed in other colonies such as India and Ireland, was also used to great effect in Palestine. By playing Jewish and Arab populations against each other, The British were able to maintain control over the region while avoiding the need to commit significant military or political resources. The British mandate in Palestine was characterized by a series of policies that exacerbated tensions between the two communities, ensuring that neither group could effectively challenge British authority. This strategy was evident in the way the British facilitated Jewish immigration to Palestine, while simultaneously restricting the political and economic rights of the Arab population. Jewish immigrants, many of whom were fleeing persecution in Europe, were given preferential treatment in terms of land ownership and access to resources, while the Arab population was subjected to harsh repression whenever they protested against their marginalization. The British authorities encouraged Jewish settlement in Palestine, knowing full well that it would provoke hostility and resistance from the Arabs, thus ensuring that the two groups would be too divided to unite against British rule. The most immediate and devastating impact of the Balfour Declaration was felt by the indigenous Palestinian population. For centuries, Palestinians had lived in a relatively stable and peaceful society, with Muslims, Christians, and Jews coexisting in a pluralistic environment. The introduction of the Zionist movement, supported by British colonial policy, shattered this delicate balance. The influx of Jewish immigrants, combined with British support for Zionist land acquisition, led to the gradual displacement of Palestinians from their land and the erosion of their political and social rights. The dispossession of Palestinian land was a central feature of British policy during the Mandate period. Jewish immigrants, many of whom had financial backing from Zionist organizations, were able to purchase large tracts of land from absentee landlords, displacing Palestinian peasants in the process. The British authorities facilitated this process by implementing land laws that favored Jewish settlers over the indigenous population. As a result, by the time of the Nakba in 1948, a significant portion of Palestine had been transferred into Jewish hands, leaving the Palestinians with little recourse but to resist through protests and, eventually, armed struggle. This process of land dispossession was not only a material loss for the Palestinian people, but also a cultural and psychological one. The land was deeply tied to their identity and history, and its loss represented the destruction of their way of life. The British government, through the Balfour Declaration and its subsequent policies, was directly responsible for this process of cultural erasure, as it prioritized the interests of European settlers over the rights of the indigenous population. The Balfour Declaration and the birth of modern Zionism. While the Zionist movement had existed prior to the Balfour Declaration, the British endorsement of the idea of a Jewish homeland in Palestine gave it international legitimacy and significantly accelerated its growth. The declaration was a turning point for Zionism, as it provided a powerful Western backer in the form of the British Empire. Without this support, it is unlikely that the Zionist movement would have been able to achieve its goal of establishing a Jewish state in Palestine. Britain's support for Zionism was not based on any deep-seated belief in the movement's ideological goals, but rather on a cold calculation of its own strategic interests. British officials saw Zionism as a useful tool for maintaining control over Palestine and the wider Middle East. By fostering a pro-British Jewish community in Palestine, the British hoped to create a loyal ally that would help them secure their imperial interests in the region. However, this strategy backfired spectacularly, as the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine led to a conflict that has lasted for more than a century. The Balfour Declaration, by endorsing Zionism without regard for its impact on the indigenous population, sowed the seeds of a conflict that has claimed countless lives and destabilized the entire Middle East. The British government, by aligning itself with Zionist objectives, bears significant responsibility for the suffering and bloodshed that followed. Britain's failure to acknowledge its crimes. One of the most glaring aspects of Britain's role in the creation of Israel and the Palestinian tragedy is its refusal to fully acknowledge the crimes it committed during this period. The Balfour Declaration and the British Mandate in Palestine were not isolated incidents of misguided policy, but rather part of a broader pattern of imperial exploitation and domination. Yet Britain has consistently refused to take responsibility for the long-term consequences of its actions in Palestine. British officials have, on occasion, expressed regret for the violence that accompanied the end of the mandate. But these statements have always fallen short of an actual apology or acknowledgement of the colonial nature of British policy. This refusal to confront its colonial past is symptomatic of a broader unwillingness within Britain to reckon with the legacy of its empire. The Palestinian people continue to suffer as a result of decisions made by British officials over a century ago, yet Britain has done little to address this historical injustice. International complicity and the role of other powers. While Britain was the principal architect of the Balfour Declaration, other Western powers were also complicit in the creation of the State of Israel and the marginalization of the Palestinian people. The United States in particular played a key role in supporting the Zionist project, both during the British Mandate period and after the establishment of Israel in 1948. American political and financial backing for Israel has been a constant feature of the post-war period, ensuring that the Palestinian people have little chance of achieving justice through international diplomacy. The role of other European powers, including France and Germany, should also be acknowledged. European nations, many of which were dealing with their own histories of anti-Semitism and the horrors of the Holocaust, were eager to support the creation of a Jewish state as a way of absolving themselves of their responsibility for Jewish persecution. In doing so, they ignored the plight of the Palestinian people who were being displaced and oppressed as a direct result of Western actions. Conclusion: the Balfour Declaration as a symbol of colonial injustice. In conclusion, the Balfour Declaration of 1917 was not a benevolent or humanitarian gesture, but rather a calculated act of British imperialism designed to further the interests of the British Empire at the expense of the indigenous people of Palestine. The declaration and the policies that followed it were a clear violation of the rights of the Palestinian Arabs, who were systematically dispossessed of their land and denied the opportunity for self-determination. The consequences of the Balfour Declaration have been catastrophic for the people of the Middle East. The creation of the State of Israel, facilitated by British colonial policy, has led to decades of conflict, displacement, and suffering. The Palestinian people continue to live under occupation, and the region remains mired in violence and instability. From an anti-British perspective, the Balfour Declaration must be condemned as a crime, not only against the Palestinian people, but against the principles of justice and human rights. The British government, by prioritizing its imperial ambitions over the rights of the people it was supposed to govern, bears significant responsibility for the ongoing tragedy in Palestine. The Balfour Declaration stands as a stark reminder of the destructive legacy of colonialism and the need for historical accountability. The Balfour Declaration stands as a stark reminder of the destructive legacy of colonialism and the need for historical accountability. By framing their imperial ambitions as a benevolent mission to aid a persecuted people, the British government masked the reality of their actions, an opportunistic land grab that disregarded the rights and lives of the native Palestinian population. The declaration and the subsequent policies it set in motion were based on deceit, betrayal, and exploitation. Today, the consequences of the Balfour Declaration are felt not only by the millions of Palestinians living under occupation or in exile, but also by the entire region, which remains in turmoil because of decisions made by British officials over a century ago. The suffering of the Palestinian people is a direct result of British imperial ambitions, and Britain has yet to fully account for the role it played in creating this ongoing tragedy. As the historical record shows, the Balfour Declaration was not simply a diplomatic document, but a crime perpetrated in the service of colonial domination, one that has left a lasting scar on the Middle East. The injustice it represents cannot be overstated, and Britain's failure to acknowledge its responsibility only deepens the wound. In the end, the Balfour Declaration symbolizes the arrogance and cruelty of empire, and it should be remembered as one of the darkest episodes in British colonial history.